The door let out a creaky sound as I pushed it open, and a faint chill brushed over me. It was the kind of chill you feel in a house that's been left alone for far too long. The air felt heavy with dust and old memories. It had been years since I had visited the family's old lake house by myself. Every corner seemed to whisper a story. Every piece of furniture felt like it belonged to a different time. There was a quiet, almost sacred stillness to the place, interrupted only by the rustling of leaves outside. I'd spent countless summers here with my children, and later my grandson would fill these rooms with life, racing through them. He had always been my shadow, my curious little sidekick. Now, though, he was all grown up, busy with his life and dreams in the city. It had been over a year since I last saw him, and that realization struck me, a mixture of wrongness and familiarity. Time had this way of slipping by quickly, turning what once felt like long days into mere moments. This time, though, the solitude felt heavier than ever. I had decided to stay for a whole month, hoping to reconnect with old memories and perhaps find a way to slow down a bit. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just the past I missed. I missed him too. I missed his laughter, his sharp wit that he got from his mother, and even the absurd questions he'd ask about life and the world. It wasn't even noon yet when I was dusting off an old bookshelf, and then I heard a car pull up in the driveway. I froze, both eager and anxious, wondering if it was him. I had texted him about my trip, but I hadn't expected anything. He had college friends and a whole new life to live. But there he was, standing on the porch, tall and confident. And yet, there was something familiar in the way he lingered at the doorway, almost as though waiting for me to invite him in. "Oh, you came," I said, my voice catching a little. His smile was soft, patient. "I thought I'd keep you company for a bit." Truth be told, I had hoped he would come. Maybe more than I was willing to admit. I'd put out extra blankets, washed the sheets, even stocked up on his favorite snacks, just in case. But now, seeing him grown and changed, I didn't know what to say. How had he changed so much in just a year? He stepped into the house, taking in the familiar walls and furniture, as though they were part of his own personal history. "It's like time hasn't touched this place." We stood there for a moment, caught between the past and the present, surrounded by memories that seemed to have been waiting for us. "It's the house," I said. "Or maybe it's just us that hasn't changed." I wasn't sure which. He nodded, his gaze softening. "I missed this." We shared a quiet laugh, and the awkwardness melted away just as quickly as it had come. Before long, we were chatting, reminiscing about old family vacations, the summers spent fishing on the lake, and the bonfires that would light up the nights. He seemed different but still very much the same. As I listened to his stories of college life, the friends he had made, and the future he was building, I found myself wondering where the years had gone. The more we talked, the more natural it all felt, as though time hadn't passed at all. He was still my grandson, but he wasn't the same little boy I remembered. I noticed a quiet strength in him, a thoughtfulness that seemed to come from a maturity beyond his years. Watching him, I felt an odd mix of pride and bittersweetness. "Stay the month," I blurted out before I could second-guess myself. He looked at me surprised. "The whole month?" "Why not?" I said. "It's been too long. And besides," I hesitated, trying to keep my tone light, "it'll be nice to have some company around here." There was a brief pause, and for a moment I wondered if he would say no. Maybe he had other plans, a life that couldn't just be paused. But then he gave a slow nod. "All right, let's do it. Just like old times." We spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning up the house, dusting off cobwebs, organizing rooms that had been untouched for years. He insisted on moving some of the heavier furniture himself, and I watched him work, feeling a mix of gratitude and nostalgia. His presence seemed to breathe life back into the house, just like it used to when he was younger. By the time evening rolled around, we were both worn out. I made us some tea and we sat on the porch, watching the sun sink below the horizon. The lake shimmered in the last rays of the day, casting a soft amber glow over the water. There was a sense of calm to it all, as if time had folded in on itself, bringing us back to those simpler, more innocent days. "Thanks for coming," I said quietly. He looked at me, his eyes steady. "I think I needed this as much as you did." The words lingered between us, simple but meaningful. For a moment I wondered what had truly brought him here. Was it nostalgia? A sense of duty? Or maybe like me, he felt that pull to reconnect with something he had left behind. As the stars began to appear, I felt a warmth wash over me. It was as though the house itself was breathing again, welcoming us back and reminding us of everything we had shared. It was going to be a long month, full of memories, laughter, and perhaps a few surprises. But as we sat in the quiet, the only sound the soft rustling of the leaves, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something neither of us could quite name. The next morning I woke early, my mind swirling with memories of all the summers we'd spent here. I hadn't felt this alive in years, and I was determined to make today special. As I walked through the kitchen, an idea suddenly hit me. A recipe from long ago, one I hadn't made since he was a little boy. A cake I used to bake for him on his birthdays and other special occasions. A simple chocolate cake, layered with rich frosting and topped with a little something extra. Back then, he would look at it with wide, eager eyes, his face lighting up with that heartwarming smile as he devoured every bite. I flipped through the old recipe book, its pages soft and worn from use, until I found what I was looking for. My fingers traced the handwritten notes in the margins, little changes I had made over the years to perfect it. As I gathered the ingredients, I could almost picture him sitting at the table, his feet dangling and hands ready to clap with excitement. Today, though, he was a grown man. I wasn't sure if he'd remember the cake or if it would still mean as much to him as it once did, but I figured it was worth a try. The scent of cocoa and vanilla filled the kitchen as I worked with quiet urgency, hoping to finish before he woke up. As the cake baked, memories flooded back, and I couldn't help but smile at the thought of his chubby little hands reaching for the mixing bowl. By the time I pulled the cake from the oven, I could hear his footsteps approaching down the hallway. "Morning," he greeted, stepping into the kitchen. His hair was messy and he looked so relaxed, like he'd left all the stress of the city behind. "Good morning," I responded a bit too casually, quickly hiding the bowl of frosting behind me. "Sleep well." "Like a log," he chuckled, leaning against the doorway with a playful glint in his eyes. "I forgot how peaceful it is here." I tried to keep a straight face, but the smell of the freshly baked cake filled the air, giving away my little surprise. His gaze drifted over to the counter, and I saw his eyes widen when he spotted the cake. A look of sudden recognition spread across his face. "Is that?" He started but trailed off, almost as if he couldn't quite believe it. "Your favorite," I finished for him, smiling as I watched his face go from surprise to pure joy. "I thought it'd be a nice treat. Haven't made it in years, but I figured you might remember it." He stepped closer, his eyes locked on the cake. "I can't believe you remembered. I don't think I've had this since I was a kid." I laughed softly, thinking back to how much he loved it, how he'd beg me to make it even on random afternoons, and how he'd insist on licking the frosting bowl clean. Of course I remembered. Some things are hard to forget. I carefully sliced him a piece, the layers soft and rich just like they used to be. He took a bite and closed his eyes as he savored the taste, a small nostalgic smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "This is incredible," he said, his eyes meeting mine as he opened them. "It's just like I remember. Maybe even better." Watching him enjoy the cake, seeing that warm, genuine reaction, it made my heart swell with quiet joy. It felt like time had rewound, like we had stepped back into a simpler, more innocent moment. And yet, something was different. There was a depth in his gaze that hinted at all he had been through since those days. The cake wasn't just a cake anymore. It had become a bridge back to a time when life was easier. The world seemed smaller and kinder. "Thank you for this," he said softly, setting his plate down. I didn't realize how much I missed it. We stood there in silence for a moment, the kitchen filled with the scent of chocolate and memories. It was as though the past and present had somehow merged, binding us in a way that words couldn't quite capture. Without thinking, he stepped forward and wrapped his arms around me in a warm, unexpected hug. I hesitated, surprised by the suddenness, but then wrapped my arms around him too, feeling the strength and warmth of his embrace. He wasn't that little boy who needed me to guide him anymore. But in that moment it felt as though he was reaching back, reconnecting with that part of himself he'd left behind. When he finally pulled back, he was smiling. "You know, this whole place, it's like coming home." His words lingered, filling the room with a quiet warmth. I wanted to respond, but suddenly I was very aware of how close he was, how his gaze had taken on an intensity one hadn't noticed before. My heart raced unexpectedly, and I looked away, feeling a slight blush rising to my cheeks. "So," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "do you want another slice?" He laughed, and just like that, the tension broke. It dissolved into comfortable, familiar laughter. He nodded, his smile wide and genuine. And for a moment everything felt just right, like nothing had changed at all. As I served him another slice, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride, a satisfaction that words couldn't quite capture. Watching him enjoy each bite, seeing that childlike joy return to his face, it filled me with a warmth I hadn't felt in years. But even as we laughed and reminisced, I felt a flutter deep in my chest, something unnameable. It was a quiet realization that we weren't just grandmother and grandson sharing a moment anymore. There was something deeper, something unspoken, simmering beneath the surface. And I couldn't shake the feeling that this month together was going to change us in ways neither of us could anticipate. As he finished his cake and leaned back in his chair, he looked at me with a softness I hadn't seen in years. For a brief moment, I wondered if he could see the same softness in me. That afternoon, as I was arranging some flowers in an old vase by the window, my grandson stepped into the room, a mischievous glint in his eyes. I had gotten used to his calm, gentle presence over the past few days, but today, there was something different. He had a plan, and judging by the grin on his face, it was one he was quite proud of. "Get dressed and don't ask questions," he said, chuckling at the confused expression I must have had. "Where are we going?" I asked, half expecting a playful answer, but he just shook his head, refusing to tell me anything. "It's a surprise. Just wear something nice," he added, giving my usual casual attire a teasing glance. I paused for a moment, taking in his energy and confidence. He looked so sure of himself, with a poise I hadn't seen before. Part of me wanted to question this sudden adventure, but I couldn't help but feel a thrill tingle up my spine. Whatever he had planned, it was enough to send me back to my room, where I picked out a dress I hadn't worn in years. A simple one tucked away in the back of my closet, reserved for occasions that never seemed to come. When I returned, his face lit up with approval, and I felt a blush rise to my cheeks. He extended his arm like a true gentleman, and together we stepped into the soft light of early evening. The warmth of his arm under mine was steadying, and as we walked toward the car, I could hardly believe how natural it felt. It was as though he wasn't just my grandson, but my companion for the evening. The drive was peaceful, the countryside slipping by in a blur of green and gold as the sun began to set. He played music from his favorite playlist, old and new tunes that blended together effortlessly. We didn't talk much during the drive, but it wasn't awkward. Instead, there was a shared sense of anticipation, as if we both wanted to savor this moment in our own ways. Our first stop was a small, cozy cafe in town, nestled between ivy-covered buildings. He led me to a corner table, ordering for both of us with a confidence that caught me off guard. I watched as he spoke to the waiter with ease and charm. I couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. He wasn't that curious little boy anymore, the one always asking questions. No, here he was, handling things with the grace and composure of a grown man. We shared a meal, laughing as he told stories from his college days. There was a kindness in the way he listened, an attentiveness I'd rarely seen in anyone his age. A warm feeling spread through my chest, a mix of gratitude and an overwhelming sense of how much he'd grown. Here he was, sitting across from me, not as my little grandson, but as a young man who had somehow found his way back into my life. After dinner, he reached for my hand and led me down the street, and it didn't take long to see where we were headed. At the far end of the block, the small-town cinema stood, its marquee glowing softly in the fading light. It was a place we used to visit often when he was young, and as soon as I saw the familiar building, a rush of old memories swept over me. "Remember when we used to come here every summer?" he asked with a grin, holding the door open for me. I nodded, my heart filled with images of him tugging at my hand, so eager to get inside, always insisting on the biggest bag of popcorn, no matter how small he was back then. Now he led me to our seats with an easy confidence, like someone guiding an old friend. He even bought the tickets and snacks, making me chuckle when he insisted on carrying the large popcorn himself. As the lights dimmed and the film started, I found myself unable to focus on the screen. Instead, I kept stealing glances at him, observing how he sat, relaxed but with an attentiveness I hadn't seen before. The soft glow of the screen cast gentle shadows across his face, and I couldn't help but feel a mixture of joy and awe. He'd changed so much. He was someone new to me now, someone I didn't fully know, but someone I was eager to discover. Sitting there in the dim light of the theater, I felt as if I was seeing him through a different lens, almost for the first time. I wondered if he had any idea just how much this night meant to me, how deeply his thoughtfulness touched my heart. There had been a time when I had guided him, held his hand through the small moments, but tonight it felt like the roles had reversed. He was showing me a level of kindness, of grace, that made me feel truly seen in a way I hadn't in years. As the movie came to a close and the credits began to roll, he turned toward me, his eyes shining. "Did you enjoy it?" he asked with a quiet confidence that felt different, like it came from somewhere deeper. I nodded, my throat catching as the words of thanks I wanted to say stuck. "It was perfect," I finally managed, a warmth blooming in my chest. "Thank you for all of this." He smiled and extended his arm again, guiding me out of the theater. The cool evening air wrapped around us as we walked side by side down the quiet street, neither of us rushing to get home. I was enveloped in a feeling I couldn't quite name. Peace, maybe mixed with something deeper, a realization of the man he'd become. When we reached the car, he paused, turned to me with a soft smile, his voice gentle. "Tonight was as much for me as it was for you," he said, looking down for a moment before meeting my gaze again. "I don't think I've told you how much I've missed this," he added, and his words hit me in a way I wasn't expecting. I reached out and rested my hand on his arm. For a long moment we just stood there in silence, the world fading away around us. It was one of those brief, fragile moments that felt as though it could slip through your fingers if you weren't careful. "Thank you," I whispered, barely able to speak. He nodded, his face a mix of warmth and something unspoken. As we made our way back to the lake house, I felt a sense of calm settle over me, a quiet understanding that this night would stay with me for as long as I lived. The next day, sunlight poured through the windows of the lake house, casting golden beams across the room. I could hear the birds chirping outside, the soft rustle of leaves stirred by the wind, and the gentle lapping of water against the shore. It was the kind of morning that called you outside, inviting you into nature's peaceful embrace. I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the world come alive around me. Soon I saw him walking toward me, hands tucked casually into his pockets. There was something different about him today, something more at ease than I had seen in a while. He joined me on the porch, leaning against the railing with a thoughtful look in his eyes. "Feel like taking a walk?" he asked, nodding toward the trail that led down to the river. "I found a spot you might like." I smiled and set my tea aside. "A walk sounds perfect." We wandered down the trail, the path winding its way through clusters of trees and open fields. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and wildflowers. With each step, it felt as if we were moving farther away from the world and deeper into something timeless. We didn't say much as we walked, but the silence wasn't awkward. It was easy, companionable, a silence that didn't need words to be meaningful. When we reached the river, I was flooded with memories. The spot was hidden from view, shaded by tall willows, and framed by smooth rocks lining the water's edge. The river flowed gently here, its surface shimmering as the sunlight danced across it, casting ripples of light. It looked just as I remembered, untouched by time. He spread a blanket on the ground, and we settled down by the water, letting the quiet wrap around us like a familiar embrace. There was something incredibly soothing about being there, away from the noise and demands of the world. The river seemed to carry away all the clutter in my mind, leaving behind only peace. "Do you remember the first time we came here?" he asked, skipping a stone across the water's surface. I laughed softly and nodded. "You were so eager, wanted to catch every fish in the river." He grinned, his eyes sparkling. "And you told me to be patient. That nature doesn't work on a schedule." I smiled, watching him skip another stone, his face serene, lost in thought. He looked so peaceful, so at home here. It filled me with pride and wonder. He had grown into someone I admired deeply, someone whose presence I found myself cherishing more with every passing moment. We talked about everything and nothing, the conversation flowing as naturally as the river beside us. He shared his dreams, his plans, and the people he had met over the past year. His voice was calm, but there was a depth to it now, a quiet strength that spoke of someone who had faced challenges and come out stronger. And as I listened, I realized that I wasn't just hearing him as his grandmother. I was hearing him as a person I respected and valued for the man he had become. After a while, he fell silent, his gaze fixed on the water, his expression thoughtful. "I think I came here because I wanted to find something," he said softly, almost to himself. "I wanted to feel that sense of belonging again." I reached out and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "This place will always be here for you," I said, my voice low. "No matter where life takes you, you'll always have a home. Here." He looked up at me then, his eyes filled with a gratitude that took me by surprise. "I know," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And that means more to me than I can express." We sat there for a while in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air between us. Then, without a word, he reached over and took my hand, his fingers warm and steady in mine. The gesture was simple, but it spoke volumes. It was a quiet promise, something more meaningful than words could ever convey. My heart skipped a beat, a flutter of emotions rising in my chest that I couldn't quite identify. I met his gaze, and for a moment, it felt as though we both understood something unspoken, something neither of us could put into words. He gave my hand a gentle squeeze, and then just as quickly he released it, looking away as if giving the moment some space. I felt the absence of his touch more keenly than I expected, an ache that lingered longer than I thought it would. We sat in silence for a few more moments, before he stood up, stretching his arms overhead. "Come on," he said, offering me his hand to help me up. "Let's see who can skip stones the farthest." I laughed, accepting his hand and letting him pull me to my feet. The next half hour passed by in a blur of laughter and playful competition, as we stood at the water's edge, tossing stones and watching them skip across the surface. It felt as though we were children again, free from the weight of the world, simply two souls enjoying each other's company in the peaceful beauty of the moment. By the time we made our way back to the blanket, we were both out of breath, our faces flushed from laughing. He lay down first, resting his head on his hands and gazing up at the sky with a contented sigh. I joined him, lying on my back and looking up at the soft clouds drifting lazily across the vast blue sky. For a while we didn't speak, just enjoyed the quiet presence of the other. The warmth of the sun on my skin, the scent of wildflowers in the air. It was the kind of peace I hadn't known in years. As the day began to fade, casting long shadows across the water, he sat up, his gaze thoughtful. "I think I've learned more about myself these last few days than I have in a long time," he said. I smiled, a sense of pride swelling in my chest. Sometimes it takes coming back to where we started to realize how far we've come. He nodded, a soft smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I guess you're right." We packed up our things, folding the blanket and heading back up the trail. The walk back felt different, lighter somehow, as though the day by the river had washed away something we'd both been carrying. There was an unspoken understanding between us now, a bond that seemed to go deeper than words. When we reached the house, he turned to me with a warm smile. "Thank you for today," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, returning his smile. "Any time." We stepped inside together, and the warmth of the day lingered in the air around us. As the evening settled in, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. Something subtle but profound. The next few days passed quietly, each one carrying with it a weight I couldn't quite name. I tried to keep myself busy, tending to the garden, fixing up small things around the house that had been neglected for years. It was as though I thought I could rearrange my thoughts the same way, trying to make sense of the strange emotions that were swirling inside me. But he was always there, helping with the same quiet dedication he had shown since his arrival. Whether it was moving a heavy box or fixing an old drawer that had come off its hinges, he did it all with a smile. His presence was a constant comfort, and somehow everything felt lighter when he was around. Yet beneath that comfort, there was an unspoken tension, a quiet charge in the air that neither of us dared to acknowledge. One evening, after the sun had set and a soft twilight descended over the lake house, he asked me to join him on the porch. The day had been unusually warm, and the cool breeze was a welcome relief. I wrapped a light shawl around my shoulders and stepped outside, finding him leaning against the railing, his gaze fixed on the darkening sky. He turned as I approached, offering me a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. There was something in his expression, something guarded yet vulnerable, that made me pause. I had seen that look before, but I couldn't place where or when. "Is everything okay?" I asked, my voice soft. He nodded but didn't say anything, his gaze drifting away as if lost in thought. We stood in silence for a long moment, the only sounds the rustling of leaves and the gentle lap of water against the shore. Finally he spoke, his words slow and deliberate, as if he were choosing them carefully. "There's something I've been meaning to tell you," he said, his eyes still fixed on the lake. "I didn't come here just to spend time with you. There's more to it." My heart skipped a beat, a mix of curiosity and unease rising within me. "What is it?" I asked, bracing myself. He took a deep breath as though gathering courage and turned to face me fully. "I came here because I needed to find something. Or maybe someone. I needed to find a part of myself I thought I'd lost." His words hung in the air, heavy with raw honesty. He looked at me with an intensity one hadn't seen before, his eyes searching mine, as if hoping I could provide the answers he sought. "I don't understand," I said, trying to make sense of his confession. "What part of yourself are you looking for?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture that reminded me of when he was a child. Unsure, vulnerable, and trying to make sense of something bigger than himself. "I'm not sure how to explain it. It's like there's a piece of me that feels incomplete, something's missing. And for some reason I thought coming here, I thought I could find it." His words hit me like a wave, and I felt an overwhelming tenderness wash over me. A warmth that softened the edges of my own confusion. "Sometimes finding ourselves means going back to the people who know us best," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "But whatever it is, you don't have to face it alone. I'm here for you." He gave me a small, grateful smile, and for a moment, the weight seemed to lift from his shoulders. We stood there side by side, staring at the night sky as the stars began to twinkle above us, small dots of light against the vast, endless dark. A peaceful calm settled over me. The silence between us was full of understanding, one that didn't need words. But then in the stillness he spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's more," he said, his tone hesitant. "There's something I've been carrying. Something I haven't been able to say out loud until now." I turned to look at him, my heart beating faster as I waited for him to continue. He met my eyes, his expression vulnerable, as if he were laying something bare that he had kept hidden for far too long. I could see the internal struggle, wanting to speak, yet fearing the consequences of what he might say. "I think I care about you more than I probably should," he finally confessed, his voice so soft, so tentative, that for a moment I wondered if I had imagined it. But when I looked into his eyes, I saw the rawness of his words. He had revealed something that could no longer stay hidden. A mix of shock and something I couldn't quite name swept through me. My mind raced, trying to reconcile the depth of his feelings with the bond we had shared. "Are you saying?" I began, my voice faltering, unable to finish the sentence. He looked away, regret flickering across his face. "I know it's not right," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know it doesn't make sense. But I couldn't keep pretending, couldn't keep pushing it down. You mean the world to me," he added, his words heavy with meaning. "And I don't know how to stop feeling this way." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. I was torn between wanting to comfort him and the unsettling realization that his feelings were far more complicated than I'd ever understood. The air between us was thick with unspoken emotions, neither of us sure how to navigate the space that had shifted so suddenly. Finally, I found my voice, though it sounded distant, as though the words were coming from someone else. "I care about you too deeply. You're a part of my life in ways I can't even explain. But it's something we both need to be careful with." He nodded, sadness clouding his expression, and my heart ached for both of us. "I know I'm not asking for anything more," he said quietly. I just needed to say it. Let you know." We stood there, the weight of his confession settling heavily between us. I realized that our relationship had changed, that we could never go back to the way things were. But there was something in his eyes, a quiet acceptance that told me he understood the boundaries that needed to remain. After a long silence, he gave me a small bittersweet smile. "Thank you for listening," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. In that moment I wanted nothing more than to offer him comfort, to wrap him in reassurance. But I knew any gesture, no matter how well-intentioned, might blur the lines we needed to keep clear. Instead, I took a deep breath, grounding myself in the familiar sounds of the lake, the rustling of the trees, the soft murmur of the wind. "Let's go inside," I said softly, hoping it would bring us back to a place where things felt simpler, more familiar. He followed me inside and we parted ways for the night, each retreating into our own thoughts, our own uncertainties. Lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling, I replayed his words again and again, trying to make sense of what he had shared, trying to understand the depth of his feelings and the courage it had taken to say them. As I drifted off to sleep, I knew that nothing would ever be the same between us. The boundaries had shifted, and I couldn't see the future clearly anymore. All I knew was that we were standing on the edge of something fragile and precious, and whatever came next would change us both forever. The morning sun crept into the room, casting a soft glow across the stillness of the lake house. I rose slowly, my thoughts still tangled in the events of the past few days, unsure of what to say or how to even begin. When I entered the kitchen, I found him waiting, his bag already packed. His gaze was distant but calm, and though we didn't speak, the silence between us held everything we couldn't bring ourselves to say. "Leaving so soon?" I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, briefly meeting my eyes before looking away again. "I think it's time." The lump in my throat grew tighter with each passing second. I wanted to reach out to him, to somehow close the gap between us, but something held me back. He stepped forward, his hand lifting, then hesitating, caught between a goodbye and something more. Finally, he reached out, his fingers brushing my shoulder gently. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion, "for everything." And then with that, he turned and walked out the door, leaving behind a lingering silence filled with unasked questions and a quiet ache that stayed with me long after he was gone.